In the early 1900s, in a small riverside town known for its pottery, a young apprentice named Clara spends her days shaping clay on the spinning wheel, feeling the cool, wet texture beneath her fingers. And she notices how each curve, each indentation, responds to subtle adjustments of pressure and speed. And in this intimate practice, she senses a rhythm that connects her not only to the material, but to generations of potters who have worked in the same workshop, leaving traces of their hands in the walls, the tools, and the grains of clay. And yet, as the town slowly modernizes with imported ceramics, factory-produced and identical, Clara begins to feel a quiet tension between tradition and novelty. Because while the machines produce vessels faster, cheaper, and more uniformly, they cannot replicate the slight imperfections that give each handmade pot its character and emotional resonance. And this awareness unsettles her, because it forces her to reflect on what it means to be valuable in a world that increasingly prizes speed over skill, efficiency over care. And as she watches factory trucks arrive at the river docks, she becomes conscious of the fragility of her craft, the vulnerability of a vocation defined by subtlety. And she realizes that preserving tradition requires more than technical skill. It requires emotional courage, patience, and the willingness to create meaning in a context that may not immediately recognize it. And as she sits by the wheel in the fading light, shaping a vase with deliberate care, she understands that her work is not merely about objects, but about sustaining a relationship with time, with material, and with human attention itself. And in this realization, Clara feels a quiet pride, because even if history advances around her, even if machines dominate the market, there exists a space where craftsmanship, observation, and patience continue to matter. And this space is hers to inhabit, fully and without apology. A small but enduring resistance against the erasure of human presence in an industrializing world. Over the next weeks, Clara begins to notice the subtle ways in which modern life is reshaping her town. Shops demand faster production, customers expect uniformity, and younger apprentices are drawn toward the factory's predictable schedule and guaranteed wages. And this observation creates a quiet anxiety within her, because she realizes that the survival of her craft depends not only on her skill, but on the attention and values of those around her. And she wonders if human patience and care can withstand the relentless pressure of efficiency. And as she continues to work at her wheel, shaping vessels with careful fingers, she reflects on how much of her identity is intertwined with this physical, repetitive labor, how the rhythm of her hands has become a meditation, a framework for thought, a way of organizing both time and emotion. And she notices that the factory cannot replicate this rhythm, cannot replicate the focus that transforms raw clay into objects imbued with intention and memory. And this awareness deepens her commitment to her craft, because she begins to understand that her true purpose is not only to produce vessels, but to embody a way of being that values depth over speed, observation over abstraction, and connection over mere output. And in this quiet internal struggle, Clara senses that history is unfolding around her, not as a distant abstraction, but as a force that shapes the meaning of her labor, the structure of her days, and the future of the town. And she understands that while she cannot stop change, she can choose how to inhabit it, preserving presence, care, and human attention, even as the world moves toward mechanized uniformity. One rainy afternoon, Clara decides to experiment with a new glaze, mixing pigments and minerals she has gathered over months, and as the liquid colors swirl across the wet clay, she feels a thrill of creation that is independent of market value or recognition, a joy that exists purely in the process. And this sensation makes her reflect on why she continues to invest herself so fully in a craft that is slowly being marginalized. Because the satisfaction is not only in the final product, but in the tactile dialogue between hands and material, the subtle adjustments and decisions that cannot be captured by machines. And she begins to see her work as a living conversation with history itself, each piece carrying traces of past masters, her own experimentation, and the anticipation of those who will handle it in the future. And in this awareness, she feels a quiet empowerment, because while factories produce efficiency, they cannot reproduce this layered intentionality. And she understands that her role is no longer simply to produce objects, but to maintain the emotional and aesthetic integrity of the craft, to preserve a human way of shaping time, attention, and meaning. And this responsibility feels both heavy and liberating because it situates her within a continuum larger than herself, linking past and future through deliberate presence. And in the glow of the fading light, watching colors set and clay take form, Clara senses that even in a changing world, there exists a space where patience, care, and observation remain not only relevant, but essential, and that her work, though increasingly rare, carries a quiet authority that no machine can replicate. In the weeks that follow, Clara begins to invite local children and apprentices to her workshop, not as formal students, but as witnesses to the craft. And as they watch her hands shape clay, she notices their curiosity, the way their eyes follow each subtle movement, the way they ask questions about color, texture, and technique, and she feels a profound sense of purpose, because even if her work is no longer demanded commercially, it can still influence perception, teach patience, and preserve the human connection to creation. And through these sessions, Clara begins to reflect on how knowledge survives outside of markets, how cultural memory is maintained through observation, repetition, and shared experience. And she understands that her role has shifted from production to stewardship, from shaping objects to shaping awareness. And in this shift, she finds both challenge and liberation, because she must now translate tacit knowledge into communicable gestures, slow explanations, and demonstrations of subtlety, all of which require immense attention, empathy, and creativity. And as she watches the children attempt to replicate her movements, making small errors and discoveries along the way, she realizes that imperfection is not failure, but a vital part of learning, a way of internalizing the craft, and that human skill, patience, and observation have a value that extends beyond immediate utility, embedding themselves into the emotional and aesthetic landscape of those who witness and participate. And in this awareness, Clara senses a new form of continuity, one that survives technological change, one that carries the essence of her craft into a future where her hands may no longer be needed, but where the lessons of attentiveness, care, and intentionality continue to ripple quietly through time. One evening, after the workshop is empty and the rain taps gently against the windows, Clara sits by the wheel, her hands resting on the cool clay, and she reflects on the years she has devoted to her craft, on the countless hours of repetition, experimentation, and observation, and she begins to see her work not merely as labor, but as a living record of attention, patience, and human presence, a subtle archive of what it means to care deeply about creation. And this realization brings both melancholy and pride, because she understands that much of what she has done may never be recognized by history or commerce, yet it persists in the skills, memories, and quiet transformations of those she has touched. And she reflects on how progress often measures value by visibility and quantity, while true craftsmanship exists in spaces that cannot be quantified, in gestures, in rhythms, in the dialogue between human and material. And as she molds a vase under the soft lamplight, feeling the wet clay yield to her touch, she senses a continuity that surpasses external acknowledgement, a lineage of presence and intention that is invisible but no less powerful. And this understanding allows her to release the anxiety of obsolescence, because she recognizes that meaning is not dictated by machines or markets, but by the care with which one inhabits time, attention, and skill. And in this quiet acceptance, Clara experiences a deep emotional shift, a reconciliation with the impermanence of her craft and the permanence of its influence on human perception. And she feels a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that even as the world changes, her hands, her attention, and her love for the process have created a space that endures beyond necessity. Over the following months, Clara begins to experiment more boldly, combining new glazes, shapes, and textures, exploring possibilities that factories cannot reproduce. And she discovers that innovation itself can exist outside mass production, arising from patience, observation, and intuition rather than efficiency or standardization. And this realization reshapes her sense of self, because she understands that her creativity is not defined by market demand, but by the quality of attention she brings to her work. And she reflects on how many aspects of human skill are invisible to history until they are consciously preserved, how technique, care, and nuance survive only when someone chooses to value them. And as she guides her young apprentices in these experiments, correcting mistakes, pointing out subtle interactions between material and process, she notices the delight and wonder in their faces, the spark of discovery that no automated system can replicate. And this awareness deepens her emotional investment, because she realizes that she is not only sustaining craft, she is cultivating perception, patience, and aesthetic awareness in others, transmitting something far more lasting than a single object. And she senses that her role has expanded, from maker of vessels to guardian of human attention and embodiment of thoughtful presence. And in this expanded role, she experiences a profound internal shift, a quiet confidence that even as industrialization spreads, there exists a space for her way of being, a rhythm of care and observation that resists erasure, and that this persistence, though subtle, carries a dignity and authority no machine or factory could ever replicate. As years pass, Clara notices the town itself transforming around her. New buildings, wider streets, and the constant hum of mechanized workshops. And while some neighbors rush to keep pace with these changes, she feels increasingly attuned to a different rhythm, one dictated not by productivity, but by attention, observation, and reflection. And this contrast creates a subtle but persistent tension within her, because she is both part of the modernizing world and apart from it, participating in its economic currents only minimally, while fully inhabiting the slower, more deliberate pace of her craft. And she begins to reflect on how progress often celebrates visibility and quantity, while the most enduring human contributions are invisible, existing in the cultivation of skill, perception, and care. And she realizes that her value is no longer determined by how many pots she can produce, but by the quality of presence and guidance she offers to the apprentices she mentors. And as she watches their hands learn to shape clay with patience and curiosity, she senses a continuity that transcends machinery, a living lineage of human attention that carries forward into a future she may never fully see. And this understanding reshapes her emotional landscape, allowing her to embrace both change and preservation, to recognize that obsolescence in one sphere does not erase worth, and that her life, though increasingly quiet and peripheral in the eyes of society, remains deeply meaningful because it nurtures the human capacities that machines cannot replicate: observation, care, and intentionality. And in this recognition, Clara experiences a profound internal stability, a quiet satisfaction that her presence, though subtle, resonates beyond immediate necessity. On a late autumn evening, Clara closes her workshop for the last time before winter. The fading sunlight spilling across the tables, the worn tools, and the still shapes of unfinished pottery. And as she walks slowly through the space, she touches the edges of clay vessels, the grooves in her wheel, and the faint marks left by years of practice. She feels a mixture of nostalgia and quiet fulfillment because she understands that her craft was never simply about production, but about presence, observation, and human connection. And she reflects on how, even as machines and factories dominate the town, the essence of her work persists in the apprentices she has taught, the attention she has cultivated, and the memory of care embedded in every piece she shaped. And this awareness transforms her relationship with time and history, because she recognizes that significance is not measured by quantity, demand, or recognition, but by the subtle, enduring influence of a patient life fully lived. And as she steps outside into the crisp evening air, hearing the distant hum of mechanized looms and feeling the steady rhythm of the river, she senses that she has carved out a space that belongs to human attention, intentionality, and quiet perseverance. And in this realization, Clara experiences a deep, calm resolution. Her identity is no longer defined by necessity, but by the presence and care she cultivated. And this allows her to move forward into an uncertain future with dignity, knowing that her life, her craft, and her way of being will continue to ripple silently through the lives of others long after the factory lights have dimmed.